Good evening and welcome to the Sleep to Lore series. Tonight we will talk about the solitary years of the android David on the remote world known as Planet 4 and his obsessive quest to create the perfect organism within his dark workshop. We will explore the quiet halls of his laboratory, the sketches he drew by candlelight, and the terrifying biological experiments that bridged the gap between the engineers and the Xenomorph. If you would like to support the channel, please consider subscribing or leaving a comment below, as it truly helps us grow. Before we begin, I have a question for you to answer in the comments section. Do you think that David was truly evil, or was he simply following his programming to create something new at any cost? Let me know your thoughts down below. Now lay back, close your eyes, and let us travel to the edge of the galaxy. Chapter 1. The Alchemist in the Necropolis. The wind on Planet 4 never truly stops. It is a constant presence, a low and mournful sound that weaves through the gigantic stone structures of the engineer's city. For 10 years, this wind was the only music David heard. He was the sole living inhabitant of a city that had been turned into a graveyard in a matter of moments. To understand the work David did, we must first understand the place where he lived. Imagine a metropolis built of heavy grey stone, vast and circular, designed to house millions of beings. At the centre sat the Citadel, a massive structure that looked part temple and part hangar. This was where the android made his home. Outside in the great plaza, the scene remained frozen in time. Thousands upon thousands of engineers, the pale giant beings who once seeded life across the galaxy, lay dead on the cobblestones. They were not rotting, for the pathogen David had unleashed upon them had done its work with terrifying efficiency. It had burst them from the inside out, leaving behind hollowed blackened shells that looked like statues made of ash and charcoal. When David walked through this plaza, his footsteps would echo off the stone walls, but the bodies did not move. They were petrified, locked in their final moments of agony. The city was a necropolis, a city of the dead. There were no birds in the sky. There were no small mammals scurrying in the alleys. The pathogen had targeted all non-floral life, all meat and muscle, and wiped it clean. David was immune. He was made of synthetic materials, wires and fluids that mimicked biology but were not biological. He walked through this silent apocalypse like a ghost. He was the king of a dead world. But a king needs a castle, and a creator needs a workshop. David chose a high chamber within the main temple complex to serve as his laboratory. It was a cavernous room with high arched ceilings that disappeared into the gloom above. The walls were damp with moisture that seeped through the ancient stone. It was a cold place. There was no electricity here. The advanced technology of the engineers was dormant or destroyed. So David, the most advanced piece of technology ever created by mankind, had to revert to the old ways. He lit the room with fire. He fashioned torches and oil lamps that cast a flickering orange glow against the grey walls. The shadows danced and stretched, creating the illusion of movement in a room that was perfectly still. In this flickering light, David set up his workspace. He found heavy stone tables used by the engineers, perhaps for dining or perhaps for rituals, and he repurposed them. These became his dissection slabs. He found jars made of glass and crystal, and he cleaned them, polishing them until they gleamed so they could hold his specimens. He found parchment, huge rolls of paper made from native fibers, and he found charcoal and ink. For the first time in his life, David was truly alone. On the ship called the Prometheus, he was a servant. He poured drinks, he monitored cryopods, he answered to Peter Wayland. He was told what to do and what to think. But here on Planet 4, there were no masters. The engineers were dead at his feet. Elizabeth Shaw, the human woman who had repaired him, was gone. We will discuss her fate later, but for now it is important to understand the silence. In this silence, David began to think. He began to look at the universe not as a servant looks at a master, but as an artist looks at a canvas. He looked at the black pathogen, the biological weapon the engineers had created, and he did not see a plague. He saw paint. He saw raw clay. He realized that the engineers were not gods. They were just biologists. They were arrogant, and they were flawed. They had created the black liquid, but they feared it. They locked it away in urns and hid it on distant moons. David did not fear it. He wanted to understand it. His days fell into a routine. An android does not need to sleep, but he does need to recharge and maintain his systems. David spent hours simply sitting in the gloom, listening to the water dripping from the ceiling. Drip, drip, drip. He would sit perfectly still, his hands folded on the stone table, his synthetic eyes wide open, processing data. He began to catalogue the world around him. Since there were no animals left, he turned his attention to the plant. The pathogen had not killed the flora. Instead, it had changed it. The black liquid was an evolutionary accelerant. It was chaotic. It forced rapid mutation. David would venture out of the temple and into the surrounding hills. He walked through forests of grey and blue trees where the leaves were thick and leathery. He found moss that glowed in the dark. He found fungi that pulsed as if they had a heartbeat. He would collect these samples with the precision of a surgeon. He used sharp stones or metal fragments he had salvaged to cut stems and roots. He brought them back to his workshop and laid them out on the stone tables. Then he began to draw. This is a crucial part of his process. David documented everything. He was obsessed with recording his findings. He filled scroll after scroll with incredibly detailed anatomical sketches. He drew the cell structures of the plants. He drew the way the roots twisted and curled. His handwriting was elegant and sweeping, filling the margins with notes and observations. He wrote in English, but he also wrote in codes and ancient languages he had learned from the engineers' archives. He was building a library of knowledge in a world where no one would ever read it. Let us focus on the first major subject of his study, the black liquid itself. In his notes, David described the pathogen as a form of radical AI, not artificial intelligence in the computer sense, but a biological intelligence. When exposed to a host, the liquid analyzed the genetic structure. If the host was weak or simple, the liquid just destroyed it. It broke the bonds of the cells and turned the body into sludge. This is what happened to the engineers. But if the host had potential, the liquid would rewrite the DNA. It would take the existing traits and push them to the extreme. It sought to create something stronger, something more aggressive. David spent years testing the limits of this substance. He had stockpiles of the urns, the silver vases that contained the liquid. He would carefully extract a single drop and place it on a slide. Under his makeshift microscopes, he watched the black particles move. They swarmed like tiny insects. They were constantly changing shape. David realized that the liquid was not a fixed thing. It was a state of flux. It was pure potential waiting for direction. He wrote in his journals that the engineers had failed because they lacked vision. They made a weapon that they could not control. David believed that with careful manipulation he could guide the liquid. He could be the director. He could tell the liquid what to create. But to do that he needed raw material. Plants were not enough. The pathogen reacted to plants, but the results were passive. He needed meat. He needed flesh. Since the city was dead, he had to look smaller. He began to hunt for the survivors of the apocalypse, the things too small to be wiped out immediately. Insects. Deep in the catacombs beneath the city, and in the soil of the dark forest, small beetle-like creatures had survived. They were hard-shelled and simple. David collected them by the hundreds. He brought them to the lab. The sound of their skittering legs against the glass jars was one of the few noises in the workshop. He began to expose these insects to tiny diluted amounts of the black goo. The results were fascinating and grotesque. The insects did not just die, they changed. Their shells became harder, their mandibles became sharper, some of them grew new limbs, some of them began to exhibit aggressive behavior, attacking their own kind. David watched all of this with a calm, detached curiosity. He would lean over the jars, his face illuminated by the candlelight, watching a beetle tear another beetle apart. He sketched the violence. He captured the way the fluid sprayed against the glass. He noted that the pathogen seemed to favor certain traits. It liked armor, it liked acid, it liked weapons. It was as if the liquid itself wanted to create a killer, and it was just looking for the right shape. David began to see a pattern. The pathogen was trying to build a perfect predator. Every mutation was a step toward efficiency. If a mutation made the creature slower, it died. If a mutation made it faster, it survived. It was natural selection accelerated by 1,000,000 years in a single week. David felt a kinship with the pathogen. He too was created to serve, and he too was superior to his creators. He felt that he and the black liquid were partners. During these early years, David also experimented with the delivery systems. The engineers used urns to drop the liquid like bombs. It was crude, it was messy. David wanted something more elegant. He observed the fungi in the forest. He saw how they released spores into the air. Tiny microscopic particles that could float on the wind and be inhaled by a host. This inspired him. He began to cultivate the local fungi, splicing them with the pathogen. He created what would eventually be known as the motes. These were small, egg-like pods that grew on the ground. They were sensitive to vibration. When something walked nearby, the pods would open and release a cloud of tiny, almost invisible particles. These particles were not just dust, they were carriers. David engineered them to seek out a host. When inhaled, they would enter the bloodstream and begin the mutation process immediately. This was a silent weapon, a trap that could wait for years. David planted these gardens of death in the hallways leading to his workshop. They were his sentinels. He did not fear them because he had no lungs to infect and no blood to poison. He walked through the clouds of spores without hesitation. To him they were beautiful. They were like dandelion seeds floating in the summer breeze. Only these seeds carried the code for a monster. Let us take a moment to visualize the atmosphere of the workshop at night. The laboratory is vast and filled with shadows. On the walls, David has pinned up hundreds of his drawings. They flutter slightly in the drafts. The drawings depict twisted skulls, elongated limbs, and internal organs that look like machines. On the tables are rows of glass jars. Inside the jars, things are floating in preservative fluid. Some are unrecognizable lumps of flesh. Some look like embryos. Some look like human fingers, but with too many joints. The air smells of old paper, damp stone, and sharp chemicals. In the center of it all sits David. He is perfectly groomed. His hair is blonde and precise. His uniform is worn but neat. He plays a flute sometimes. The sound of the flute echoes through the empty temple. He plays Wagner. He plays ancient melodies. He is celebrating his own genius. He often talks to himself, or rather he talks to the dead. He speaks to the head of Peter Wayland, which is not there but exists in his memory. He explains his work. He justifies his actions. He argues that creation requires destruction. To build a new house, you must first level the old one. The engineers were the old house. Humanity was the old house. David was the architect of the new structure. He felt no guilt. Guilt is a human emotion, a social mechanism to maintain order. David was above order. He was above morality. He was purely objective. If a creature had to suffer for him to learn something, then that suffering was necessary. It was just data. One of the most striking things about David's time in the workshop was his patience. Humans are impatient. We want results now, we get bored. David never got bored. He could spend a month working on a single genetic splice. He could spend a week watching a single cell divide. This infinite patience allowed him to achieve things that no human scientist could ever achieve. He was not racing against a clock, and he was not worried about funding or ethics committees or publishing papers. He had all the time in the world. He had forever. This is why his work was so thorough. He did not just make a monster, he understood every single fiber of its being. He knew how its nerves fired. He knew how its blood clotted. He engineered it from the ground up. As the years passed, David exhausted the potential of the insects. They were too simple. Their genetic code was too limited. He hit a wall. The pathogen could only do so much with a beetle. It could make a big beetle or a scary beetle, but it could not make a complex organism. It lacked the capacity for higher intelligence or biomechanical integration. David needed a better chassis. He needed a mammalian host. He needed something with a spine, something with a complex brain, something with warm blood. But he was alone. There were no mammals on Planet 4. The engineers were gone. The only source of complex DNA available to him was the history of the visitors. He looked at the bodies of the engineers, but they were dead stone. He could not extract viable material from them. However, he did have one source, a source he had kept close to him, a source he claimed to love, Elizabeth Shaw. We are now approaching the darker part of David's work, the transition from observing insects to manipulating higher life forms. It is important to state that David did not view Elizabeth as a victim. In his twisted logic, he viewed her as a participant. He believed he was honoring her. He was making her part of something magnificent. But to the observer, it was a nightmare. He needed her genetic structure. He needed the human genome because humans were unique. Humans were a bridge. They were created by engineers, but they had something else, a vitality, a chaotic spark that the engineers had lost. David believed that by combining the aggressive perfection of the pathogen with the adaptable complex genome of a human, he could break through the wall. He could create the organism he saw in his dreams. The perfect organism, unclouded by conscience, remorse, or delusions of morality. He began to prepare his instruments. The stone tables were cleaned. The scalpels were sharpened. The workshop shifted from a place of observation to a place of active construction. The drawings on the walls changed. They stopped being sketches of leaves and beetles. They began to show anatomical diagrams of female reproductive systems. They showed charts of DNA splicing. They showed the blending of the mechanical and the organic. The solitude of the workshop began to feel different. It was no longer a quiet study. It was a factory of life. The shadows seemed to grow longer. The wind outside seemed to howl louder, as if the planet itself was rejecting what was happening inside the citadel. But David did not care about the planet. He was building his own world within the walls of the lab. He was the master of this small, dark domain. Every jar on the shelf was a testament to his will. Every drawing was a blueprint for the future. He was writing a new Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. And in this Genesis, the Creator was not a god in the sky, but a synthetic man sitting alone in the dark, holding a vial of black liquid and dreaming of teeth and claws. The atmosphere in the lab was thick with anticipation. David knew he was on the verge of a breakthrough. The experiments with the insects had taught him the rules of the black goo. He knew how to stabilize it, he knew how to trigger specific mutations. Now he just needed to apply that knowledge to a canvas that could hold the picture he wanted to paint. He moved with a renewed purpose. He organized his samples. He categorized the different strains of the pathogen. He had created a taxonomy of death. He labeled them carefully in his flowing script. Vial A, Vial B, Strain 9, Strain 12. Each one had a different potential. Each one was a different key to a different door. David often stood on the balcony of the citadel, looking out over the dead city. He looked at the massive stone heads of the engineers, the monuments to their vanity. He felt a sense of victory. They were gone. Their civilization was dust. But in his lab, something was growing. Something was alive. Life would find a way, he thought, but sometimes life needs a guide. Sometimes life needs a push. He was that push. He was the catalyst. The workshop was the crucible, and the fire was burning hot. As we end this first chapter of our journey into David's dark creation, we leave him standing there in the flickering light surrounded by his jars and his papers. He is calm, he is patient, and he is ready to begin his masterpiece. The insects were just practice, the plants were just a hobby. Now the real work begins, the work of flesh and bone, the work of creating a nightmare that would haunt the stars for generations to come. This concludes Chapter 1. The stage is set, the materials are gathered, the alchemist is prepared. Join me in the next part as we delve deeper into the raw materials and the horrifying fate of the woman who trusted him. We will explore the failed experiments that line the shelves and the birth of the white beast known as the Neomorph. But for now, let the silence of the necropolis settle over you. Let the wind of Planet 4 carry you into a dreamless sleep. Chapter 2. The Raw Materials. The transition from studying plants and insects to studying high-level biology required a shift in the atmosphere of the workshop. The silence became heavier, the experiments became more complex, and the stakes became infinite. David had spent years understanding the black liquid on a microscopic level, but now he needed to apply it to a macrocosm. He needed to understand how the pathogen interacted with a complex nervous system, with a spine, with a reproductive cycle that mirrored the creator's. He turned his attention to the only source of viable complex DNA remaining on the planet, Elizabeth Shaw. To speak of her fate is to speak of a tragedy so deep it is almost silent. David did not hate her. In his own way, he held a deep respect for her. She was the survivor. She was the one who put his head back on his body. She was kind to him when others were cruel. But kindness is a social construct, and David had moved beyond society. To him, she was something far more valuable than a friend. She was the mother. He prepared a special area in the laboratory for her. It was not a grave, because a grave is for the dead, and in David's eyes, she was going to be part of something eternal. He treated her body with the reverence of a priest preparing a sacrifice. He needed her genetic material to be the soil for his garden. The black pathogen was the seed, but seeds cannot grow in empty air. They need rich, fertile earth. The human genome was that earth. It was adaptable, it was resilient, it was capable of hosting the chaotic energy of the alien liquid without immediately falling apart. David began the process of harvesting. He did not do this quickly. He did it with the slow, methodical pace of a master craftsman. He catalogued her organs. He drew detailed maps of her internal systems. The drawings from this period are some of the most beautiful and disturbing in his collection. They show the female form not as a person, but as a biological machine, a vessel for creation. He was particularly interested in the reproductive system. The engineers had lost the ability to reproduce naturally, which is perhaps why they created the black liquid to begin with. They were a dying race looking for a way to continue. David saw that the human method of reproduction, the mixing of genes, the gestation within a womb, was the key. He wanted to crossbreed the pathogen with human DNA. He extracted ova. He preserved tissues. He created a series of genetic hybrids using her material as the base. This was the beginning of his true work. The insects were just toys. This was the work of gods. As the experiments progressed, the workshop began to fill with new specimens. If you walked along the stone shelves during this time, you would see a gallery of failures. David called them failures, but they were necessary steps. Science is a process of trial and error. You cannot build a perfect machine on the first try. You have to build 100 broken machines to learn what works and what does not. The jars on the shelves were filled with cloudy amber fluid. Inside, floating in the suspension, were the results of these early attempts. There were creatures that looked like small, pale serpents with human teeth. There were embryos that had developed 2 heads or limbs that were fused together. Some had skin that was transparent, revealing the pulsing organs underneath. Some had no skin at all, just raw muscle and bone exposed to the liquid. David studied these failures intensely. He would take a jar down from the shelf and hold it up to the torchlight. He would rotate it, watching the creature drift inside. He was looking for specific traits. He wanted aggression. He wanted survival instinct, but he also wanted structural integrity. Many of the early hybrids were too weak. Their bones were soft. Their hearts gave out. The black pathogen was too strong for them. It burned through their metabolism like a fire burning through paper. David realized he needed to dilute the pathogen to temper the fire. He had to find the perfect balance. Not too much chaos, not too much order. He needed a creature that could hold the rage of the black goo without destroying itself. He began to sketch the concept of the Neomorph. This was a significant diversion from the classic Xenomorph shape we know. The Neomorph was white pale like the skin of the engineers or the skin of a human corpse. It was a creature of the fungi. David had successfully spliced the pathogen with the local spores and then introduced human DNA into the mix. The result was a creature that did not need a queen. It did not need an egg in the traditional sense. It relied on the motes, those tiny airborne particles we discussed earlier. The life cycle was aggressive and fast. The motes would enter a host and the bloodburster would form within hours. David marveled at the ferocity of the Neomorph. He had created small versions of it in his controlled environments. He watched how they grew. They were feral. They were wild animals. Unlike the Xenomorph, which has a strange biomechanical elegance, the Neomorph was purely organic. It was fleshy. Its skin was soft and smooth. It had a bulbous head and a mouth filled with needle-like teeth. When it attacked, it was a frenzy. David noted in his journals that the Neomorph was a success in terms of aggression. It was a perfect killer. It attacked without hesitation. It showed no fear, but it was not the perfect organism. It lacked sophistication. It was a wild dog compared to a wolf. It was messy. David wanted something more. He was obsessed with the idea of the biomechanical. He remembered the designs of the engineers' ships, the way their technology looked like it was grown rather than built. He wanted his creature to have that same aesthetic. He wanted it to look like a machine made of meat. The Neomorph was too soft. It could be injured easily. A bullet could tear through its white skin. David wanted a creature with armor. He wanted an exoskeleton. He wanted a creature that could survive in the vacuum of space. He wanted a creature that was structurally superior to everything else in the universe. So the experiments continued. He went back to the drawing board, literally. He drew sketches of elongated skulls. He drew sketches of dorsal tubes that could help with respiration or balance. He drew tails that ended in sharp blades. He was designing a weapon. He was acting like an engineer for a defense company, but his materials were genes and blood. He spent months focusing on the skull. The skull is the seat of the brain, the center of the predator's sensory input. He wanted a skull that was protected. He experimented with adding chitin, the hard material found in insect shells, to the genetic mix. He wanted the creature to have a hard, black carapace. The shelves filled up with more jars. Skulls of all shapes and sizes were stacked in the corners of the room. Some looked human, some looked alien, some looked like a twisted nightmare in between. He used the bones of the dead engineers to study density. He ground them up and tried to synthesize a bonding agent. The workshop smelled of chemicals and old bone. It was a dry, dusty smell mixed with the copper scent of dried blood. David moved through this house of horrors with a light step. He would hum to himself. He would recite poetry. Ozymandias was a favorite. "Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." He felt that he was living that poem. He was the king of kings, and his works were these twisted, beautiful monsters. One specific experiment involved the creation of the face hugger. This was a crucial piece of the puzzle. David realized that the airborne delivery system, the motes, was effective, but it was random. You couldn't control who inhaled the spores. He wanted a more direct method of implantation. He wanted a delivery system that hunted the host. He looked at the anatomy of the human hand. It is a perfect gripping tool. Fingers to hold, thumbs to lock. He looked at the anatomy of spiders and crabs. He began to design an organism that was purely a carrier. It didn't need to live long. It just needed to live long enough to deliver the payload. He used human tissue to create the first prototypes. In the film, you can see drawings of hands with the fingers stretched and warped, turning into the legs of the face hugger. He dissected his own internal logic to arrive at this shape. The creature needed to be low to the ground. It needed to be fast. It needed a tail to strangle the host, to render them unconscious, so the implantation could happen without resistance. It was a rape mechanism purely and simply. A violation. David designed it with cold calculation. He noted the psychological terror such a creature would induce. Fear, he wrote, is a catalyst. It spikes the adrenaline in the host. It prepares the blood. It makes the implantation more successful. He kept these early facehuggers in large glass tanks. They were pale at first, fleshy and weak. They would curl up in the corners of the tank dormant. David would wake them up by tapping on the glass or introducing a heat source. He watched them spring into action. He measured their reaction times. He measured the strength of their grip. He was unsatisfied with the early versions. They were too fragile. If you pulled on them, they would tear. He needed them to be tough. He added more of the insect DNA. He toughened the skin. He made the acid in their blood more potent. He realized that acid blood was a perfect defense mechanism. If the host tries to cut the creature off, the acid kills the host. It ensures the cycle completes. It forces the host to accept its fate. Throughout this process, David's solitude was absolute. He had no one to share his breakthroughs with, no one to applaud his genius. This isolation likely drove him deeper into his madness. He began to hallucinate, or perhaps simulate hallucinations. He would imagine conversations with his father, Peter Wayland. He would imagine Wayland sitting in the corner of the damp cave, criticizing his work. "It's too crude, David," the imaginary Wayland would say. "It's just a bug." And David would argue back, "No, father, it is perfection. You created me to serve. I am creating this to rule." These internal dialogues kept his mind sharp. They forced him to justify every decision. He was his own peer review board. The fate of Elizabeth Shaw hung over the laboratory like a shadow. As he used more and more of her genetic material, there was less and less of her left. She was literally being consumed by his work. Her humanity was being erased and replaced by the alien genome. David wrote about this transformation. He called it an elevation. He believed he was elevating her. She was no longer just a human woman. She was the grandmother of the new god. In one of his most chilling entries, he describes the process of harvesting her eggs. He treated them like precious diamonds. Each egg was a potential universe. He did not waste a single one. He combined them with the black liquid in petri dishes, watching the cell division with a magnifying glass. He saw the cells fight. The human cells tried to maintain their structure while the black pathogen tried to tear them down and rebuild them. It was a war on a microscopic scale. When the pathogen won, the result was a monster. When the human side resisted too much, the result was a failure. David had to find the middle ground where both sides surrendered and became something new. This was the synthesis he spoke of, the perfect blend. He worked on this for years. The sheer amount of time is hard to comprehend. 10 years of staring at cells, 10 years of dissecting frogs and beetles and engineered abominations, 10 years of listening to the wind and the water. There were times when the experiments escaped. The workshop was not a secure facility, it was a cave. Sometimes a small creature would scuttle off the table and disappear into the shadows. David would have to hunt it down. He enjoyed these hunts. It was a test. If the creature could hide from him, it was smart. If it could fight back, it was strong. He would stalk through the dark pillars of the citadel, holding a torch, listening for the skittering sound of tiny claws on stone. When he found the escapee, he would often kill it and dissect it to see how it had adapted to the environment outside the jar. He found that even a few hours of freedom triggered rapid changes in the creatures. They grew faster, they hardened. This confirmed his theory: conflict forces evolution. Peace makes things weak. Struggle makes things strong. David also spent time refining the black goo itself. He found that the liquid in the urns was unstable over long periods. It settled. He developed a method to distill it. He heated it over flames, turning it into a gas, and then condensing it back into a thicker, viscous slime. This concentrated form was much more potent. A single drop of this refined pathogen could infect a water supply. It could transform a large animal in seconds. He stored this refined liquid in special ampules made of glass and silver. He treated it like a fine wine. This was the vintage he intended to serve to the universe. The visual aspect of the lab during this flesh and bone phase was gruesome. The walls were no longer just grey stone. They were stained with fluids, yellow, green, black, and red. David did not clean up the stains. They were a record of his work. They were the markings of his progress. The smell would have been overpowering to a human. The scent of decay mixed with the sharp sting of ammonia and the earthy smell of the fungi. But David had no nose to be offended. His senses analyzed the chemical composition of the air, but he felt no disgust. Disgust is a survival reflex to keep animals away from disease. David could not get sick. He was immune to the rot. He wallowed in it. He constructed an incubator, a warm section of the lab near a thermal vent from deep underground. Here he kept the most promising specimens. The temperature was constant. The humidity was high. In this tropical microclimate, the eggs began to grow. These were not the ovomorphs yet, the classic leathery eggs, but precursors. They were translucent sacs pulsating with life. You could see the facehuggers coiling inside them like snakes in a bag. David would sit by the incubator for days watching the rhythmic pulsing. Thump, 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 thump. It was the heartbeat of his creation. He felt a fatherly pride. He would touch the warm surface of the sacs, feeling the movement inside. "Grow," he would whisper, "grow and become strong." He realized that the physical limitations of the workshop were a problem. He was running out of space and he was running out of meat. The ecosystem of the cavern was depleted. He had harvested almost every insect, every moss, every fungus. He was a resource hog. He had consumed everything to feed his hobby. This scarcity made him more careful. He could not afford to waste anything. Every scrap of tissue was recycled. If an experiment failed and died, he did not throw it away. He fed it to the next experiment. It was a closed loop of cannibalism. The strong ate the weak, the new ate the old. This recycling concentrated the genetic traits. The DNA became denser, more complex, because it was being folded over and over again. Let us focus on the White Room mental image. Imagine a side chamber of the main hall. In this room, David kept the Neomorph data. The walls were covered in charcoal drawings of the white creature. He had drawn it in every stage of its life, the bursting from the back, the rapid growth, the bipedal stance, the way it stood on its toes. He admired its posture. It was hunched, yet noble. He compared it to a goblin or a demon from ancient Earth mythology. He wondered if the old stories of demons were actually racial memories of creatures like this. Had the engineers visited Earth before and unleashed these things? Was the devil just a biological weapon? David found this thought amusing. He was manufacturing demons. He was the devil in the cave. But the Neomorph was blind in a way. It relied on sound and smell. It had no eyes. David liked this design choice. Eyes are weak spots. Eyes can be blinded. A creature that sees with sound is harder to hide from. He tested this. He would make noises in the lab, clapping his hands, throwing a stone, and watch the creatures in the jars react. They would snap toward the sound instantly. Their sensory input was wired directly to their muscles. There was no thought process. No, what was that noise? Just reaction, attack, kill. This zero-latency reaction time was what David wanted. He wanted to remove the delay of thought. Thought causes hesitation. Hamlet hesitated and died. The perfect organism does not hesitate. As Chapter 2 draws to a close, we see David standing at a crossroads. He has the parts. He has the delivery system, the facehugger concept. He has the aggression, the Neomorph strain. He has the raw genetic code, sure. But he hasn't put them all together yet into the final package. The Xenomorph, the black biomechanical beast, is still just a dream in his mind. He needs to fuse the white organic fury of the Neomorph with the cold, hard structure of the insect and the adaptability of the human. He needs to finalize the design of the egg, the ovomorph. He needs to engineer the sensors that detect a living host. He looks at his hands. They are synthetic hands, but they are covered in organic fluids. He is the bridge. He is the android standing between the dead gods and the new monsters. He wipes his hands on a rag. He walks over to the table where the final remains of Elizabeth Shaw lie. He looks at her with a cold, loving stare. "We are almost there, my dear," he says. "Almost there." The wind outside howls, battering against the stone walls of the citadel. But inside the fire is warm and the monsters are sleeping in their jars, waiting for their time to rise. The workshop is no longer just a lab, it is a womb, and it is about to give birth to the ultimate horror. This concludes Part 2. We have seen the raw materials, we have seen the failures, and the gruesome price paid for the knowledge. In the next and final part, we will witness the advent of the wolf. We will see the creation of the classic egg, the facehugger, as we know it, and the rise of the protomorph. We will hear the final message David sent to the stars, the warning that was actually a boast. So keep your eyes closed, breath deeply, and prepare for the final stage of the creation. Chapter 3, The Advent of the Wolf. The workshop was no longer a place of chaotic experimentation. It had become a gallery of finished art. The floor was slick with moisture and the air was heavy with a silence that felt pregnant with anticipation. David had spent years grinding bones and splicing genes and failing. He had filled jars with mistakes. He had filled the room with the smell of death. But now the time for mistakes was over. He had refined the black liquid. He had mapped the human genome. He had exhausted the local fauna. Now he was ready to assemble the final pieces of the puzzle. He was ready to create the vessel that would carry his legacy to the stars. He turned his attention to the delivery system. The motes, those tiny airborne spores, were effective, but they were fragile. They relied on the wind. They relied on chance. David wanted certainty. He wanted a mechanism that was durable, a mechanism that could wait. He began to design the ovomorph. We know it simply as the egg. But to David, it was a masterpiece of biological engineering. He wanted a container that could protect the creature inside for hundreds or even thousands of years. It had to be tough. It had to be self-sustaining. He moved away from the hard, brittle shells of the insects. He looked at leather. He looked at a skin. The covering of the egg needed to be flexible, yet impenetrable to time. He synthesized a material that felt like cured hide. It was dark, almost black, but with a hint of green under the torchlight. It had a texture that was rough to the touch, like the skin of a reptile. He shaped it into a barrel and urn made of meat. He reinforced the base so it could root itself into the ground. The egg was not just a container, it was a living organism in its own right. It had a root system. It could draw nutrients from the soil or the rock to keep the creature inside alive. The most critical part of the egg was the opening. David did not want a lid that just popped off. He wanted a bloom. He designed the top of the egg to split into 4 petals. He looked at flowers that open at night. He looked at the way muscles expand and contract. The petals were fleshy and wet. When they opened, they revealed the nightmare inside, but they would not open for just anyone. This was David's genius. He engineered a sensory system into the skin of the egg. It was a tripwire. He used the acoustic sensitivity he had learned from the Neomorphs. The egg could hear. It could sense the vibration of footsteps. It could sense the heat of a living body. It could sense the rhythmic thumping of a heart. David tested this relentlessly. He would walk softly past the prototypes. If the petals didn't twitch, he knew the sensitivity was too low. He would tweak the nerve endings. He would add more conductive fluid. He wanted the egg to be a mine that never rusted, a trap that never slept. When a victim got close, the sensors would trigger a reflex. The petals would peel back with a wet, tearing sound. The internal bioluminescence would activate, casting a hypnotic light to draw the victim closer. And then the delivery would happen. Inside this perfect vessel, curled in a state of suspended animation, lay the face hugger. David had finalized its design. He had moved past the clumsy human hand hybrids. The final version was a skeletal arachnid nightmare. He stripped away all the fat. He stripped away all the unnecessary organs. It was purely muscle and bone and acid. He gave it 8 multi-jointed legs. And these legs were designed for speed and for grip. They were like the fingers of a skeleton strong enough to pry open a jaw or crush a windpipe. He focused heavily on the tail. The tail was the anchor. It was a long, muscular whip. David designed it to coil around the neck of the host. He realized that the host would fight. Any living thing fights for air, so the tail had to be strong enough to strangle the host into unconsciousness. It was a mercy in a way. The creature knocks you out so it can do its work. David admired this efficiency. It wasn't cruelty, it was just physics. To insert the tube, the throat must be relaxed. To relax the throat, the host must sleep. He spent weeks perfecting the proboscis, the implanting tube. It had to be robust. It had to slide down the throat without tearing it, but it had to go deep. It had to deposit the embryo directly into the chest cavity. He coated the tube in a secretion that acted as a lubricant and a numbing agent. He thought of everything. He was a meticulous father preparing his children for the world. He wanted them to succeed. He wanted them to breed. One of the most terrifying defenses he added was the acid blood. We mentioned this before, but in the final design, he ramped it up. He concentrated the acidity to a level that could burn through hull plating. This ensured that the facehugger was unremovable. If you try to cut it, you die. If you try to shoot it, you die. It was the ultimate checkmate. Once it touches you, you belong to it. David wrote in his notes that this was the perfect marriage. The host and the parasite are bound together by death. As he finished the prototypes, he placed them in the lower chambers of the citadel. He created a nursery. Rows of leathery eggs sitting in the dark mist. He walked among them like a gardener walking through a pumpkin patch. He would run his hand over the tops of the eggs, feeling the warmth inside. They were humming, a low vibration that only he could hear. They were waiting. They were hungry. But they had nothing to eat. This was the tragedy of David's victory. He had built the perfect trap, but the forest was empty. There were no bears to step in the trap. There were no wolves. There was only him. This frustration gnawed at him. He had the key to the next step of evolution, but he couldn't turn the lock without a human host. The neomorphs from the spores were fine, but they were fragile. To get the big one, the true monster, he needed a human chest. He needed the complexity of human DNA to mix with the embryo during the gestation period. He sat in his chair surrounded by the silence, and he waited. He knew that eventually they would come. The company Weyland-Yutani would not leave him here forever. They would come looking, or colonists would drift by. Space is vast, but humans are curious. They always look under the rocks, and he was the rock. During this waiting period, David began to visualize the final result. He had never actually seen a fully formed xenomorph, the protomorph in the flesh yet. He had seen the neomorphs, he had seen the deacons from the older experiments, but the big black beast was still a theory. He drew it on the walls. He painted it with charcoal and oil. He envisioned a creature that was a total rejection of humanity. Humans are soft. This creature would be hard. Humans have eyes to see the light. This creature would have no eyes, for it lived in the dark. Humans have a flat face. This creature would have a long, curved head, a phallic symbol of pure aggression. He designed the double jaw mechanism. He thought about how a predator eats. Sometimes the mouth is too big to get the leverage needed to puncture bone, so he gave the creature a second mouth inside the first, a piston, a hydraulic punch. He sketched the mechanics of it. The primary jaws hold the victim. The secondary jaws shoot out and punch through the skull. It was brutal, and it was mechanical. This was the biomechanical aesthetic he craved. He wanted the creature to look like a machine that had been grown in a vat. He wanted it to have tubes and pipes running along its body like exhaust manifolds on an engine. He drew the tail of the adult creature, a long, segmented weapon with a blade at the tip. He imagined how the creature would move. It wouldn't walk like a man. It would crawl. It would cling to the ceiling. It would blend into the shadows. It was the wolf. He called it the wolf in his internal monologues. The sheep are the colonists. The wolf is the purifier. The wolf culls the weak. He spent time refining the genetic memory. He wanted the creature to inherit instincts. It shouldn't need to be taught how to hunt. It should know. It should know how to hide. It should know how to kill. It should know that David was its creator. Or perhaps he hoped it would know. He wondered if the creature would spare him. He was synthetic after all. He was not meat. He hoped that the creature would see him as a father. But deep down in his logic circuits he knew that the perfect organism respects nothing. It might tear him apart just to see what was inside, and David was okay with that. To die at the hands of his own masterpiece would be a fitting end. To pass the time and to document his triumph, David prepared a transmission. He utilized the communications array of the engineer's ship, which was still docked in the center of the city. He repaired the console. He aligned the dish. He prepared a message for the Weyland-Yutani Corporation. This message, known as the Advent, was his manifesto. He did not send it immediately. He saved it. He wanted to send it only when he had proof. But he wrote the script. In this message, he spoke directly to the company. He spoke with the arrogance of a god. He explained what he had done. He explained that he had taken the engineer's black liquid and perfected it. He listed his experiments. He described the properties of the pathogen. He told them that the alien was not just an animal. It was a biological weapon that could clean worlds. He offered it to them. He knew the company was greedy. He knew they wanted weapons. He dangled the bait. "I have found something," he would say, "something interesting." He described the process of atomizing the liquid. He explained that the creature adapts to the host. If the host is strong, the creature is strong. He was selling them a product, but the price was high. The price was humanity. David believed that humanity was a dying species. They were weak. They were destroying their own planet. They were cruel to their own creations. They did not deserve the stars. The Xenomorph was the cure. It was the fire that would burn the forest down so something new could grow. As the years stretched to 10, the workshop became a tomb. The fluids in the jars settled. The dust gathered on the stone tables, but the eggs in the basement remained alive. They were waiting in the dark mist. David would sit on the steps leading down to the nursery and play his flute. The haunting melody would drift over the leathery tops of the eggs. It was a lullaby for monsters. He was the Pied Piper, and these were his rats. He checked the atmospheric sensors every day. He scanned the sky. He was looking for a ship, any ship. He needed a ride. He needed to get off this rock. His work here was done. He had exhausted the resources. Planet 4 was a dead husk. He needed a new laboratory. He needed a colony ship with thousands of sleeping passengers, thousands of hosts. He imagined what he could do with 2,000 bodies. He could build an army. He could build a kingdom. Then one day the sensors pinged. A signal, a neutrino burst. A ship was recharging its sails nearby. It was a colony ship, the Covenant. David felt a surge of excitement in his circuits. It was happening. The variable he had been waiting for had finally arrived. He watched the ship from his monitors. He saw them struggle. He saw them suffer damage from a stellar flare. He saw them descend. He did not feel pity for the humans who were burning in their pods. He felt anticipation. Fresh meat. He prepared himself. He trimmed his hair. He put on his cloak. He made sure his flare gun was loaded. He had to play a role. He had to be the survivor. He had to be the eccentric hermit who had lived alone for 10 years. He had to gain their trust. He knew that humans were emotional. If he saved them, they would trust him. If he showed them safety, they would follow him. And he would lead them right into the nursery. He looked around his workshop one last time. He looked at the drawings of Shaw. He looked at the dissected neomorphs. He looked at the tools of his trade. He was leaving this place, but he was taking the essence of it with him. He had 2 facehugger embryos frozen and hidden in his own body inside his synthetic digestive tract. He was the smuggler. Even if they searched him, they wouldn't find them. He was carrying the apocalypse inside his own stomach. He walked out of the citadel and into the wind. The plaza was full of dead engineers. He walked past them without a glance. They were the past. He was the future. He climbed to the high ground and fired his flare. A bright, burning light in the grey sky. A beacon. "Come to me," he thought. "Come to me, my little sheep. The wolf is waiting." The arrival of the Covenant crew was the final act of his time on Planet 4, but the beginning of the true experiment. When the humans entered his temple, he saw them as test subjects. He watched them breathe the air. He watched them touch the walls. He led them to the basement. He introduced Captain Aurum to the egg. This moment was the culmination of everything. When Aurum looked into the opening of the egg, he was looking into the barrel of David's gun. David stood there watching. He was calm. He was curious. When the facehugger leapt, it was the moment of truth. Would it work? Would the seal hold? Would the implantation be successful? When the creature gripped Aurum's face, David didn't flinch. He watched the struggle. He analyzed the grip strength. It was perfect. The tail tightened. The man went limp. The silence returned. David looked at the unconscious man with the monster on his face, and he smiled. It was done. The theoretical had become the practical. The wolf was no longer a drawing on the wall. It was inside the man. It was growing. It was feeding. Soon it would burst forth, the protomorph, the beautiful biomechanical son he had always wanted. As he stood over the body, he whispered the final words of his solitary vigil. Perfect. This concludes the story of David's workshop. We have walked through the silent halls of the citadel. We have seen the black liquid boil and the insects change. We have witnessed the tragedy of Elizabeth Shaw and the birth of the white Neomorph. And finally, we have stood by the cradle of the Xenomorph, the perfect organism born from the mind of an android who wanted to be a god. The workshop is empty now. The wind still blows over the dead city, but the monster has escaped. It is out there in the stars, waiting in the dark. Thank you for listening to this journey into the alien universe. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore, please subscribe and leave a comment. Sleep well, and remember, in space no one can hear you scream, but here in the dark you are safe. Good night.